I first realized that the environmental movement was probably a little dishonest back in the 80s when I saw a news program. Michael Dukakis, when he was governor, had a press conference in front of Turner's Pond in Milton, and he said that acid rain has killed the fish in this pond. Well, I was a little upset to learn that because I would go to this pond with at the time my oldest daughter. She was just a little girl. And, well, I thought, what a shame, and we need to do something about this. And I'm still a conservative, but, we got to deal with this. Well, about 6 months later, I went to the pond, and guess what I saw in that pond? Fish. And people fishing and catching fish. So I thought, well, but this was supposed to be dead. So someone's lying to me here. Someone's being dishonest. I remember hearing a lot about acid rain killing trees. And I did my own scientific experiment. When I was a bachelor, I used to keep houseplants, and bachelors they don't necessarily take care of the houseplants or anything else as well as they should. But when the warm weather came, I put this, I think they call it a spider plant. I put it out in the backyard. The spider plant was half dead, and by September, early October, the thing had grown to 5 times its size, and it was just a beautiful looking plant outside amongst the acid rain. And I was telling my friends, telling them that, look what acid rain has done to this poor plant. It's killed it. And people were looking at it and saying, gee, you're right, that's terrible. They were looking at a very healthy plant, yet they were saying that I had convinced them that it was dying. So every time you see a dead tree, we thought it was acid rain. You see a mountaintop of dead trees, it could be an insect, it could be a fungus. Oh, no, it's acid rain. You see, and that's how they're able to suck us in. I picked up an article in the Boston Globe, and I wish I saved it because it was an article about the Vermont maple syrup crop. It said that the trees are dying because of acid rain, and that some of the trees are so old they have tomahawk markings in them, right? And then I read that. I says, well, trees don't live forever, and one tomahawk, I'm thinking 200 years ago. So I said, well, maybe they should plant new ones at some point. Doesn't it make sense? Mm-hmm. So about 4 years after that, I was working in Vermont as a field rep for the JBS, and guess what? I saw an article on the front page of the Montpelier newspaper in bold headlines: USDA claims largest maple syrup crop in the state's recorded history. So somebody is lying here, folks, and I'm not quite sure, who it is. Well, our speaker, I think, is going to help expose a portion of that misinformation. And I got a chance to meet him down at the Climate Change Conference back in March. And what I'm going to do is read his the official credentials from the outline we got, the book we got from the conference. Joseph DeLeo has more than 3 decades of experience as a meteorologist and climatologist. In other words, he's not a political science, he's a hard scientist, okay? He is executive director of IceCap, an organization and website devoted to climate change issues, and the website is icecap.us, and I do encourage you to visit that website and help support it. He was a professor of meteorology for 6 years at Linden State College in Vermont, that's up in the St. Johnsbury area, and from 1981 to 1988 was the first director of meteorology at the Weather Channel. From 1989 to 2004, he was chief meteorologist at WSI and senior editor and Dr. Dew Point for its popular IntelliCast.com website. He was a weather producer for ABC's Good Morning America while planning the Weather Channel with John Coleman. He is a certified consultant meteorologist and is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society. He has served as chairman of the American Meteorological Society's Committee on Weather Analysis and Forecasting and has chaired or co-chaired several national conferences. He mentioned that he was in the White House giving a speech and his PowerPoint projector didn't work properly, so I could imagine that. He has written a book and presented papers on how research into ENSO, and other atmospheric and oceanic phenomena and solar cycles has made skillful seasonal and even decade forecasts possible. He also has written many articles and made numerous presentations on the role cycles in the sun and oceans have played in the climate change. In other words, this fellow has credentials. Let's give him a warm welcome and applause.
And in Vermont 2 years ago, actually on top of Mount Washington 2 years ago, there was a conference of scientists who predicted that because of global warming, there would no longer be any snow in New England. Winters would be 2 weeks long, and the maple syrup industry would disappear because the maple trees would all disappear up into Canada. And that was before the winter that Hal described, where they had set all new records for seasonal snowfall in New England 2 years ago. It came very close to repeating that this year, and also set an all New England record for lowest ever temperature recorded, minus 50 degrees in Maine last winter. So you see how they go. I usually talk mainly about the science part, but I wanted to mix a little bit of politics in here. As you probably know, global warming is not a new issue, and it probably relates and started decades ago, as early as the 70s, when the Club of Rome, a global think tank, was formed. In 1993, it published a follow-up book in which they said it would seem that humans needed motivation to bring about the divided nations, to bring them together to face an outside enemy, either a real one or one invented for that purpose. And of course, the common humanity enemy is man. Democracy is no longer well suited for the tasks, and in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution and the threat of global warming would fit the bill. And so there's been a coordinated effort to produce change and to scare the public into thinking that we're causing a planetary emergency, as Al Gore likes to say. And the UN was chosen as the vehicle to lead the change. And it sees it as a chance to transfer wealth and achieve the goal of one world governance. They orchestrated an infiltration of the universities, the national societies, and the scientific magazines. All of the editors are environmentalists, and they don't allow papers that disagree with global warming to pass peer review. And I've seen this firsthand as a counselor of the American Meteorological Society, involved with many people as editors of these of the journals of the society. But also the governments and the NGOs, the environmental groups, funded research into global warming to support an agenda to their benefit. And of course the media, left-leaning, found this issue fits their agenda and produced a whole series of films and documentaries and stories that present only the alarmist side. You never see a story about, gee, there's no warming change going on, or perhaps there's cooling. It's always a disaster story. All the magazines, even Sports Illustrated, showing a football player up to his knees in water. All of the networks have done specials, and all the 6 degrees could change the world, and Planet in Peril. You've seen them. All the networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, of their science directors, reporters, or who have very little background in science, Blakemore, Bazell, Pelley, O'Brien, said all that they will not speak to skeptics in doing their pieces on the air because they don't need to anymore. The science is settled. They call us flat earthers and then equivalent to Holocaust deniers. And then there's the 3 movies, The Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore, The 11th Hour by Leonardo DiCaprio, and The Day After Tomorrow, that were popular and helped to frighten children and make the world believe that maybe there is an issue. This is Leonardo DiCaprio showing how much science was in his movie, and also how many people paid to see it. And then, of course, we've got Al Gore. Gore on 60 Minutes told them in March 30th that people who oppose this global warming consensus are in a tiny, tiny minority now with their point of view. Those who dare to challenge him are almost like the ones who still believe that the moon landing was staged in a movie lot in Arizona, and those who believe the earth is flat. There's so few of them that he's committed $300 million to convince him he's right. As the American thinker, James Lewis, said, he's starting a $300 million PR campaign to convince everybody. Excuse me. I don't need to know that, thank you. When was the last time you saw $300 million spent to promote a scientific hypothesis that was proven? We're not spending millions of dollars to prove the existence of gravity. The uproar and the money involved in this fraud is in direct proportion to the lack of solid facts. And as the late Michael Crichton said, historically the claim of consensus has been used as the first refuge of scoundrels. It's a way to avoid debate by claiming the matter is already settled. And he was exactly right. His book is excellent. Is there a consensus on global warming? Among some there is. Among the climate modeling scientists and researchers who are benefiting from government and foundation grants to the tune of $5 billion a year, and Obama wants to increase that to study global warming? Absolutely. Among the environmental groups who've benefited to the tune of $50 billion the last decade from this issue? Yeah, you betcha. Among the politicians who see carbon schemes as new tax potential and corporations who think they can profit from green product imaging? Yes. When Goldman Sachs gets up there and strongly supports this carbon tax and carbon cap and trade, I can assure you it's not because they care about the polar bears. Among liberal journalists who sensationalize real or imagined disasters because that sells and it suits their agendas, yes, there's consensus. All of those. But how about among real scientists, the geologists, the physicists, astrophysicists, solar scientists, geographers, and chemists that I've met all around the world that came to our conference that Hal mentioned, 1,000 this year in the two conferences. They have no skin in the game. They don't get government grants. They look at the data objectively. There's no consensus. They're skeptic. Among most of the climatologists and forecasters and broadcast meteorologists that I deal most closely with, not in the modeling money loop, no, most believe that natural variability can't be ignored. And this skepticism is especially true with the older scientists who have seen this frenzied reaction to change before. We remember the magazines in the 30s and 40s that told us that, the world was heating up, and of course the Dust Bowl of the 30s, and then the cold weather in the 60s and 70s that led us to believe that there was going to be an ice age. And I have a CIA report that says there's a consensus of scientists that the Earth is cooling and that there's damage potential to agriculture worldwide and will not be able to feed the world's people from 1974. And then, of course, now the magazines and newspapers are the other direction. How many people remember in 1979 this story from Time magazine where Winooski, Vermont, ground zero for the green movement in the East, came up with a scheme that put a dome over the city of Winooski to protect itself from the cold. Of course, the next summer was hot, and they would have fried themselves. But if you saw the Old Farmer's Almanac, I don't know if it's still available, but I was fortunate enough to be able to publish a story that talked about how over time we thought it was going to be cold, and the newspapers and the media talked about the heat, and then they talked about the cold, and now again the heat. And it was very well received this year, and the forecast that we made for this past winter was right on target. The Heartland, as Hal mentioned, and 20 other groups, actually in this year 66 groups were involved as co-sponsors. We had conferences in New York City. In the first year, 500 skeptics and 100 speakers. I was one of the speakers. This year, 1,000 attendees, 80 speakers, all skeptics. You could count the number of media people on one hand that attended, mostly from the blogs and the independent, maybe the Washington Times, but certainly none of the majors. The petition project in Oregon has 34,000 signatures from U.S. scientists, 9,200 PhDs, saying that there's no scientific evidence that greenhouse gases are producing harmful effects. But we still hear the media say, and people involved in the media say stupid things like Liz Colbert from New Yorker, who says, people are complaining about $3 gas. We need $8 gas. In order to discourage use of fossil fuels. And Ted Turner, perhaps you remember, if global warming isn't stemmed, we'll be 8 degrees hotter in 30 to 40 years, and basically none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. He said this on Charlie Rose's show. Other notable quotes. Christine Stewart, the Canadian environmental minister in '98, says, it doesn't matter if the science is all phony, there's a collateral environmental benefits. Climate change provides the greatest chance to bring about justice and equality in the world. And then Maurice Strong, who Hal mentioned, in 1992, the Hal Earth Summit, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? And Mr. Obama's working very hard to achieve that goal. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. Right on target. Enron was involved, the big bad guy, but they don't get any credit because people don't like Enron. They worked closely with the Clinton administration to create a scaremongering climate science environment because they saw potential monstrous carbon trading financial windfalls like they had with sulfur dioxide and acid rain. They made a ton of money on acid rain. Boy, they said if we can do the same with carbon dioxide, we can really clean up. And so they contributed money to the Nature Conservancy to do research to try to find the link, and spent money on the environmental groups to promote the topic. They went to Al Gore and Clinton with a letter, said, you have to go after any scientists who argue that it was an overblown issue because they're standing in our way. And that's when they started to go after us with Greenpeace with their site Exxon Secrets, blaming anybody who disagreed, claiming that they disagreed because they were under the influence of ExxonMobil, or the oil companies are paying them big bucks in order to have them challenge the science, which is undebatable. And the letter asked the president to shut off the public scientific debate on global warming. And there's an inconvenient truth. The UK court, with thanks to Christopher Monckton, found 9 blatant errors or exaggerations in the movie and required that students be told that if the movie was to be shown, they had to be read those 9 exaggerations so they got a balance. That doesn't happen here in the United States, but it is the case in the UK. Like the 20-foot sea level rise. You remember that lift in the movie where if you watch the movie, it goes up to the top of the studio to show you how high 20 feet is. He could have used the Boston phone book. Lord Monckton cited actually 35 serious scientific errors and distortions, exaggerations, and he and 3 others have challenged Gore to debate, and he's ignored that. He doesn't want any debate. Marlo Lewis, CEI, did an analysis of the book and found wrong statement, misleading statements, exaggerated, one-sided, speculative. And Czech Republic President Václav Klaus, one of my heroes, exposed his subtle, deliberately deceptive methods. When he gives a talk, he doesn't allow the media in, and there are no questions. If he does an interview, you've got to submit the questions in advance to him, and he's got to approve them, as he controls what he's asked. He also set up GIM, Generation Investment Management, in the UK, and sending people to invest in heavily subsidized renewables. It's about $5 billion. And he says, the money I make from all of this goes to non-profit. By the way, his own company. And he gets a tax benefit. He's conflicted to a great extent. It's illegal for him to give a talk in England because of his involvement with Jim. He talks around the rest of the world. And he's a phony because he bought a condo by the sea in San Francisco. If he was really worried about sea level rise, I don't think he would do that. Now, the UN IPCC is a scientific body tasked to coordinate global action to man-made global warming. And people say, well, why would they lie? Well, they were formed to coordinate global action to man-made global warming. If they went off and did an independent study and found no global warming, they would be disbanded. They would have no jobs. There were 4 assessments. The process is that science teams assess the current state of the science and prepare initial assessment. And then a smaller team of lead authors that includes some scientists, and mostly environmentalists, UN political statesmen, write the summaries. And they have the final say and interpret the findings to suit their mission. Leading scientists have quit because the lead authors were ignoring good science. The media and alarmists claim we had 2,500 scientists behind the latest report. And with 90-degree certainty, we found that man was behind global warming. In reality, there were 2,500, but they were not all scientists. They were economists, sociologists, environmentalists, UN statesmen. Even the secretaries were counted in that group. There was some token skeptic scientists, but they ignored their input. IPCC reviewer Michael Schlesinger from the University of Illinois recently in a debate was asked what percentage of the IPCC knew anything about climate. He said, well, maybe 20%. The number of scientists handpicked by the UN and environmental leaders to be lead authors is small. It's only 52, and 5 did most of the writing of the summary for the policymakers. Handpicked, small group, mission, decided ahead of time what they were going to say. Scientists, go off, do your work, so we can have a nice thick book to publish, but we've decided what we're going to say. There's another report that Obama is claiming this is the definitive, the gold standard. It was the CCSP 2009. It went to the EPA on the 16th of this month. It's based on a report that was coordinated by a Hollywood producer, Susan Hassel. She was a producer for Larry David's comedy shows, but they thought that she could really make this look classy. And then he charged a PR firm, Resource Media, the firm that was behind the Apple scare, the Alar scare for apples, to use that and work with the Union of Concerned Scientists. We call them the Union of Confused Scientists, but it's really an environmental group, to come up with a list of the most extreme talking points. And of course the media obliged by reporting on those findings as if they were scientific. And in Copenhagen, a lot of shenanigans are going on because in December the World UN meeting is going to decide on the follow-up to Kyoto, which failed as an experiment, despite the claims that it was a great success. Most of the countries didn't get close to their emission goals, found their energy costs, drove away industry, hurt their economies, and even overturned some governments. The goal of all of this is to transfer wealth, to major cutbacks and transfer of wealth to poorer countries via the UN. Now, here's the talking points that Obama and the UN have used. Global warming is far worse than expected in the models in the IPCC. Oceans warming rapidly, endangering sea life. Sea levels rising more rapidly than forecast, and that IPCC estimate of 7 to 23 inches, that was too conservative. Heat waves are increasing in frequency and will increase much more in the years ahead with increased mortality. There's more severe weather coming. Hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, and floods. There's melting in the Antarctic that's unprecedented, and Greenland melting is accelerating, and Antarctic ice is breaking up that will lead to catastrophic sea level rises. And species like the polar bears are endangered by loss of habitat. And all of these can only be explained by greenhouse gas emissions. You can't explain it by the sun and natural factors. And we must act now to save the planet and life as we know it, to avoid some kind of tipping point. The only constant in nature is change. Let's look at the science. We can look back in time and reconstruct the past, the history of the temperature and carbon dioxide, by looking at various things. In terms of temperature, we have thermometers only recently. We've had a lot of problems with those measurements, but we'll talk about that. But you can go back and look at pollen and isotopes and glacial and ice cores and fossils and rocks, and determine and get an idea of what the temperature was like at a given point in the past. When you do that, you see some very predictable and repeatable cycles, and this is going back 450,000 years. You see about every 120,000 years, there's a warm-up called an interglacial, and then you go into this steep and very lengthy 100,000-year cold period where the glaciers spread. There's major glaciation. The last one spread as far as New York City and Long Island. And then you come out and it warms up. And the difference between the warm periods and the cold periods is like 18 degrees Fahrenheit globally on an average. We're lucky to be alive, and the reason why we're here is that we're in an interglacial period, a relative warm period. These changes can be explained by the Sun-Earth orbital parameters that changes, how elliptical, the tilt of the Earth on its axis, when it's closest to the Sun and when it's farthest to the Sun, and that varies over time, and these can combine to produce these long-term changes. In the last interglacial, the current warm period, there actually are ups and downs too, and it was especially warm around 1400 BC, and in the Roman warm period at 100 or 200 BC, and then in the medieval warm period around 800 to 1000 AD, and then the latest relative warmth. But you can see there's a tendency or trend to actually go down, and especially when in the cooler periods are getting colder. This is the last 2,000 years. And you can see about 600 AD up to about 1200 AD, it was quite warm around the world, significantly so. And so much so that the Vikings settled Greenland, which is called green land because at that time was green, and they were able to grow even grapes and make fine wine. And then it cooled down, and they had to leave Greenland, and we went into the Little Ice Age in the 1600s. Now, hockey stick, you may be familiar with, was an attempt to do away with this problem, because every time people would say, we've got global warming, the response would be, well, if it warmed back around 800, 900, 1,000, and man didn't have SUVs back then, and we weren't burning fossil fuels, and that was natural, why couldn't this be natural? So this proved to be a problem, and Michael Mann solved that by working with some what he called sweet zone pine cones in northern Arizona and a few trees, and a new algorithm to interpret all of the data. And what he did is he basically wiped out the medieval warm period, wiped out the Little Ice Ages, and then he appended the temperature record uncorrected for urbanization at the end, and we got a hockey stick. And that made it look like, gee, temperatures were constant until man got involved. Now we got a problem. So Al Gore uses this as a movie multiple times. The IPCC in their third assessment had at least 5 times in there, the hockey stick. But there were many flaws in it. That data, those pine cones were inappropriate. They weren't better measurement of precipitation than they were of temperature. They found that the algorithms that they used to produce that analysis would have produced a hockey stick even if you put random data in. So they did the corrections, the Congress got involved, they analyzed it and restored the medieval warm period. CO2 Science has a project called Medieval Warm Period Project where they look at peer-reviewed papers. They've so far gone through 710 scientists report from 414 institutions in 41 different countries and counting, and all confirmed that the medieval warm period was real. And there's a lot of information in the literature, including and our art, that shows that the Little Ice Age was real. This is the Thames River, where they used to have ice parties on the Thames every winter in the Little Ice Age. Well, what about that global database that shows that warming? Well, there's major issues with that NOAA conveniently likes to ignore. They dropped out 2/3 of the stations in 1990. Most of them were all. I'll show you. Missing data increased tenfold at that time. They make no adjustment for urbanization, even though the population of the world went from 1.5 to 6.7 billion dollars, 50 billion people since 1900. The siting for a vast majority of the observing sites do not meet government standards set with significant warm biases that result. It's supposed to be out on a grassy surface, 100 feet away from the nearest obstacle, the nearest tree or building, exposed to the wind, properly ventilated if you use the shelter, and you'll see very few sites actually meet that criteria. And the data centers are also under the control of alarmists, and they make manual adjustments. They don't tell you what adjustments they are. There's no visibility for quality checking or validation. They also have very poor data for the oceans, and we've changed methods. We used to have buckets to measure from ships, and then we went to ship intake, and now we use satellite. And they each have different, measured at different height, and in the ocean makes a big difference. And they've had tremendous difficulty trying to piece together the history of the ocean temperatures, and the ocean covers 70% of the Earth. If you have all of these issues, how can you hope to detect trends to the precision of a tenth of a degree? You can't. No way. This is the coverage, by the way, in 1978 of the Earth stations. Should put pretty much decent coverage over the continents, or over the islands and the oceans. And so compare that to 2008, after the stations dropped out. No Canada. Now, we had a brutal winter in Canada, so that doesn't go into the database anymore. No Greenland, hardly. Much of Brazil, hardly anything in Africa, holes in Australia, Siberia, Russia, tremendous missing data. Mostly rural locations are now missing in the data that they use. Urbanization, they say, well, it's not really that important. Well, this is a study by Goodridge in '96 for California with counties over 1 million, showed a 4-degree warming Fahrenheit. Counties between 100,000 and 1 million population, 1 degree. Counties with less than 100,000 show no warming. Urbanization does make a difference. In fact, NOAA doesn't correct for urbanization. NASA does in their U.S. version of the database. And when you do the difference of the two, you can see NOAA's database introduces an artificial warming by ignoring urban heat islands of 3/4 of a degree Fahrenheit. Most of the warming that has occurred in 100 years is because of urbanization. And you all know, you watch the local TV weather show, it's going to be 40 here in town, but if you live out in the suburbs, it's going to be the upper 20s tonight. And where's the thermometer? Logan Airport. This is before they made the the U.S. data actually had an urban adjustment in their first version in 1990. They removed it in 2007. So they removed it because it was inconvenient. The results were not showing warming, or showing this current warming wasn't as significant as the prior one. When you remove it, boom, now you got a little bit of a warming. Okay, now we solved the problem. They cooled off the 1930s, so we made the dust bowl a little less extreme, and we warmed up the recent decade. Then you have the siting issue. And remember, it's supposed to be out in the middle of a field. This is one climate site next to a garage, next to a bush, over a Weber grill. Now, when you barbecue, you might see a little bit higher temperature that particular day. This one's next to an air conditioner exhaust, because the new thermometers have some cable limitations. So instead of having it out in the grassy field, they had to put them next to buildings. An appropriate location. This one in Tucson, Arizona, of all places, in the parking lot. You think it gets hot on the pavement? In fact, when Anthony Watts at surfacestation.org with his volunteer network, he's almost done with it. He's gone through almost 1,000 out of the 1,221 climate stations. He found only 2% in blue met the standards. 8% came reasonably close, but 90% had errors greater than a degree centigrade, or 2 degrees, 1.8 degree Fahrenheit, because of their bad location. They found them in waste treatment plants, a large number of thermometers on roofs, many on pavements, at airport, on runways. Most of the country, in orange and red here, you have bad sighting. Numerous peer-reviewed papers ignored by the IPCC and by this latest report say at least half of the warming can be explained by this these factors. Give you an example of the discrepancies. NOAA proclaimed just recently that May 2009 was the fourth warmest May in 130 years for the world. NASA satellites, they measure from satellites. They look at the whole Earth, not just pockets. They look at the oceans too, and they're more accurate. They're not subject to, local factors. They said it was the 15th coldest in 31 years. Last June, NOAA said it was the 8th warmest in 129 years, but NASA satellite showed it was the 9th coldest. The satellites are right, but the headlines don't make the headlines. NOAA's reports do. Now, you ask NOAA administrator, where's the best data? They say, well, it's satellites, but how come you don't use it in your releases? Well, it only goes back 30 years. Oh, okay. But they said, we're going to solve that in the future. We have this climate reference network that we're starting. We'll have 114 high-quality, well-sited stations. But that won't be complete for years and useful for a decade or more to get any kind of trending. Look at the difference between the satellite and NOAA data. It's been increasing since 1979 to 2009. This is the two different locations in the University of Alabama, one in California, RSS, that measure from the satellite sensors what the temperatures of the globe are. And you see NOAA's almost half a degree warmer than the satellite. And over the last 8 years, temperatures from the satellite in blue have been going down. And even the land stations on the short term, the trends are useful because urbanization isn't going to change in an 8-year period. Even Hadley's version of the global data has been going down, even as CO2 has gone up. So there's been cooling for 8 years. Have you heard about that anywhere in the media? This is how it compares. This is done by Lord Monckton, how it compares to the IPCC forecast during that time period. It's worse than expected, though, according to the IPCC. If you look at the history, even with the bad lifting up of the recent data, you see that we get cool periods and warm periods and cool periods and warm periods. And the warm periods tend to be 2 decades or so in length. It was very intense going into the Dust Bowl, and then it cooled down into the late 70s. Very intense warming for 2 decades, and then a cooling has begun. It's in that 2 decades where the temperatures and the CO2 parallel each other that they had a case. They said, see, there's a correlation here. Well, it's no longer a correlation. The other data supports the fact that the earlier warming in the 1930s was greater. If you look at Des Moines' June and July records, there were 61 days in June and July, the daily records. You find none after 1988. There were 5 in 1988, most of them in the 1930s, none this decade. So they've set no record highs. We're supposed to be having increasing heat waves, according to the reports, and it's going to only get worse. The U.S., same story. 1930s dominates. 37 before 1970 of the all-time state record highs were set before, like I said, 1970. And only one was tied in South Dakota in 2006. It tied a record in the 1930s. Not exactly an accelerating warming. How about Central Park, where they said that in the cities it's only going to be worse? Well, this is showing a number of 90-degree days in blue, and in purple a number of 100-degree days. You see the 30s and 50s had a lot of 100-degree days. We had a mini spike in 1990 and none this decade. So there's also not what they say. How about the world? Where are the record highs in the world? In Africa, 1922. North America, 1913. Asia, 1942. Australia, 1889. Europe, 1881. South America, 1905, the ocean, the islands of the ocean, 1912, Antarctica, 1974. Well, we started measuring in the late 50s. So, but you see any recent heat evidence in the globe data? No. How about that smoking gun? They said, oh, the super powerful hurricane, smoking gun, according to StopGlobalWarming.org. This is the index of measuring global hurricane activity. It set a new record for least activity in the last 2 years. Now, we had a spike in the 2004 and 5 in the Atlantic with the warm Atlantic, oscillation, a 70-year oscillation. It peaked then, and it's dropped off there. But the Pacific was quiet then, and they're both quiet right now. So we're at a new minimum. So there's no smoking gun there. The number of violent tornadoes has been going down. The number of droughts, you see, there's no increase in the frequency of drought, nor a significant increase in the significance of flooding. How about sea level? Oh, remember, IPCC says the best guess is between 8 and 22 inches. Al Gore said 20 feet. Hansen upped the ante and said 246 feet. But Holgate has shown that the rise has slowed in recent decades. You can see from 1980 on, it actually slowed, and especially this decade, and actually over the last, since 2005 or 6, it has flattened out and it's hardly changing at all. It's not getting worse. It's not far worse than expected or increasing, and you know, planetary emergency. Why is it slowing down? Because the oceans have been cooling. When the oceans cool, they contract. And you can see, they said the oceans are warming and have been warming. This is what NASA has projected in their model. It's the possible lower limit. The observed heat content of the ocean by Willis from NOAA and Lowell has shown the heat content has declined since 2003. So the oceans are cooling. The atmosphere is cooling. The sea levels are not rising. Where's the emergency? Where's the urgency to pass cap and trade? There is none. The main evidence for greenhouse role is that CO2 has been rising since reliable measurements began and emissions have been increasing, and in those 2 decades we're at parallel temperatures. The global climate models showed warming accelerating. That's where they're really focusing on these climate models. And they say, oh, the greenhouse effect, you can't deny it. Well, there's no paper that proves the greenhouse gas effect is producing global warming. From first principles. They just start with that assumption. Greenhouse effect is a real effect. Clouds and moisture hold in some of the heat, otherwise we would be colder. But carbon dioxide is not a significant greenhouse gas. It's only 0.038% of our atmosphere by volume, compared to up to 4% for water vapor, the primary greenhouse gas. Only 2.7% of the atmospheric CO2 is man-made, and it's up a little bit from a decade ago. But even with that increase in emissions, we comprise just 0.001% of the atmosphere is man-made carbon dioxide. And the rate in which carbon dioxide has changed over the last 50 years has remained a steady 0.45 per year. You can see it varies year to year a little bit, depending on whether there's an El Nino or La Nina in the ocean, but the rate has not accelerated. And again, and looking at the greenhouse effect, water vapor is 95% of the greenhouse effect. And you know, on humid days, it stays warm at night. It's on those dry days, it can be dry and hot, but it cools off in the evening. Water vapor does produce some heat trapping, but CO2 is a trace gas and a minor player. An experiment, actually real data helps to show that CO2 doubling would not have a significant effect. Here's the plot of carbon dioxide on a weekly basis in Salt Lake City going back to 2002. And you can see in winters you see a spike in the CO2. This is the background level around 380 parts per million. You see in the winter it jumps up to 500 parts per million because the trees are dormant. And the trees take in the carbon dioxide. It's plant fertilizer. And they give off oxygen. When the trees go dormant, the ground is snow cover, the inversion over Salt Lake City traps the carbon dioxide, so it goes up to double the level. Well, if it was double the level in the winter, and before, say in the late 1800s, Salt Lake City was a rural area with very little, urbanization, and now is an urban area. Well, one would then expect to see the temperature there in winter as a good indication of what would happen when CO2 doubled. No change. So CO2 has gone from low levels to double that level in winter in Salt Lake City without any effect on temperature. Good case study. Last 500 million years, The new paper came out and says it's the highest it's been in 300 million years. Well, not true. CO2 in red here was much higher much of the last 500 or 600 million years. We had a low period. We're at one of the lowest levels of the time period. And there's very little correlation with temperature. If anything, the temperature leads the carbon dioxide, not the other way around, because it's the ocean's warm side. Just like as you take a cold Pepsi Cola out of the refrigerator and open it and drink a little bit and let it sit on the counter and warm up, it defizzes. The oceans give it off when it warms. So the temperatures lead the CO2, not the other way around. And it's allowed us to, because it's a plant fertilizer, to grow more and more places with the recent warming of that 2-decade period. Threefold increase in crops. Some of that is due to better hybrids. A lot of that is due to more CO2. And when plants are more vigorous, they're also more drought resistant, produce more moisture into the air, allow for more rain to fall, the hydrological cycle continues, and the population is doubled. We've been able to feed more of the people. How about those climate models? Well, even the climate modelers will tell you they're not very good. None of the climate states and models correspond even remotely to the current observed climate, said one of the lead authors of the IPCC report, Kevin Trenberth. And climate prediction is hard, said another lead author. Only half the variability is predictable. We don't expect to do terrifically well. How are the models doing with regards to temperature? They forecast that rise in temperature. Remember, we saw one example of this in Moncton's slide earlier. This is actual temperature, reality, showing temperatures have declined where the model said it was going to increase in the last 8 years. It looked like they're doing really well. And this is the government's report showing what their projections are for temperature, but you see the temperatures are not obeying their models. The models say it's supposed to be very warm, and this is called the signature of global warming, of greenhouse gas warming, in mid-levels, about 20, 30,000 feet, down to 18,000 feet. It's supposed to be tremendous warming in low and mid-latitudes. This is 75 degrees north, the equator in the middle, 75 degrees south. That's what the climate models say is supposed to happen. Well, we measure with satellite and balloons the temperature in the tropics, and we don't see that. There's no match. If this was in the court of law, there'd be no DNA match, no fingerprint match. CO2 would be acquitted. Most of the warming in the models doesn't come from CO2. It comes from positive feedback that they build in when they say when the CO2 increases and it warms a little, we get higher water vapor content, which traps more heat. We get more tropical high clouds that trap more heat. There's less overall in low clouds, and we get more solar warming, and therefore that's what produces all the warming in the models. But in the absence of that, CO2 by itself would produce very little in the way of warming for doubling. Satellite weather balloon data suggests strongly these are not positive feedbacks, but are negative feedbacks, and that was presented in a number of papers at the ICCC conferences in the last 2 years. What are the natural drivers? Well, the oceans, the sun, volcanism. They were covered in the IPCC science chapters, but downplayed in the models and ignored in the summaries. And I'm not going to get into the Atlantic and the Pacific oscillations, but there are multi-decadal oscillations on a scale of about 60 to 70 years. Where the Pacific warms, you get more El Niños, cools, we get more La Niñas, which are cool events like we've had the last 2 winters, and then when it warms again, more El Niños. In the Atlantic, we go through cool and warm periods. When it's warm, there's more hurricanes and more East Coast storms, and when it's cool, the global temperatures drop. I added the two together, the Pacific and decadal and the Atlantic decadal oscillation, compared it to the U.S. temperatures. You see how well they correlate with each other. So the oceans are driving the temperature, and I could show that and I do in my scientific presentations more detail, but I don't want to get into that. Don't have time for it. Volcanic eruptions also play a role. When Mount St. Helens and El Chocón went up in the early 80s, and Pinatubo and Cerro Hudson in the early 90s, you see global temperature shown at the top from satellite showed a cooling that lasted 3 or 4 years. But look what happened in the early 2000s. There was no volcanic eruption. The atmosphere was unusually clean. That allowed more sun through, and that helped with the warming of the early 2000s. Recently, we had a major eruption in Alaska last year, and again this year. That's helped with the cooling. The sun plays a cycle role too, and it's cycles. There are all different cycles on the sun. The most commonly known one is the 11-year cycle. You may have heard it's been unusually quiet, this cycle, at the minimum, usually long. The average of 11 years, but they range from 9 to 13 years in length. When the sun is less active, there's very few sunspots, flares. The sun is a little less bright, a little less hot. We're a little less hot. When it's active, there's lots of activity on the sun, and we're hotter as a result. But you see, each 11-year cycle is not the same. Going back to the 1700s, some of them are very active, and some are very quiet. And you can see there's a cycle of about 100 years shown in there, where at the beginning of every one of the last 3 centuries, the sun was relatively quiet, and then became active during the middle part of the centuries, especially this last century in what was called the grand maximum. But there's also a 200-year cycle going back in time, that if that is going to phase with 100-year cycles in the next few decades, suggest a very quiet sun, like the early 1800s, a very quiet period, the time of Dickens. Now, the cyclical factors in the sun include the direct effects. This is the only one that the IPCC looks at, and they say, oh, it doesn't change enough for us to consider the sun as an important factor. But there are a lot of indirect effects that they ignore, like UV increases 6 to 8% during even the 11-year cycle compared to 0.1% of the brightness. And that causes ozone chemistry that produces, it's an exothermic reaction that produces warming in the high atmosphere in low and mid latitudes. There's geomagnetic storms that warm high latitudes and produce the aurora. The active sun produces an active sun reduces low clouds by diffusing galactic cosmic rays, which help to create cloud nuclei, make it more efficient as cloud nuclei. So there's less cloudiness, more sunshine during an active solar period, more cloudiness, and less sunshine during a quiet time period. This month has been one of the cloudiest months in June. I think it may turn out to be the second cloudiest June on record at Blue Hill. Why? Because the sun is very quiet right now. When I did a correlation of the sun, the total solar radiance, which is sort of it's a proxy for all of these factors, with the temperatures, again I found a very strong correlation. The edges were growing thicker in the middle, and in fact, if you look at the temperatures in Greenland, they really were warm in the 30s and 40s, and it cooled for 5 decades into the middle 90s, while CO2 was rising rapidly. And only started rising in 1995, when the Atlantic, in its 70-year cycle of warming and cooling, went warm. But the Atlantic has peaked and is now cooling. It's back down negative. The graph doesn't show that far out, but Greenland has probably peaked in its warmth at a level lower than the 1930s and 40s, and so the Greenland ice melting has probably reached its peak and will not be significant. And these guys, are they endangered? Well, the population has quadrupled since 1970. 21 populations. 2 of the 21 populations of polar bears have decreased, but they're in areas that are cooling. The 2 that have increased are in the areas of warming, and the other 19 are stable. So there's no threat to the polar bear. In the late 1900s, but less than the global databases suggest due to contamination. The temperatures are cyclical and they're changed. The temperatures peaked in 98, have been declining for 8 years. The models are failing. They say it's far worse than the models show, and I say no, the models are far worse than in reality. Man plays a role in climate change mainly through urbanization. I don't deny that we produce heat, in our urban heat islands. But the sun, oceans, and volcanism play dominant roles in climate change, and the changes in the oceans, the cooling, and the sun showing signs of a long-term minimum point toward a continuing fall in temperatures ahead. I'm more worried about a cooling over the next few decades than warming. And the focus on carbon and carbon dioxide in the vote today in Congress is misguided, ridiculous, obviously politically driven. Eisenhower, in his last address, his farewell address to the nation in 1961, said, "Public policy could itself become captive of a scientific technological elite, partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract become virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. You give somebody a grant, tell them go search, find global warming. You better find global warming if you want more money. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and gravely to be regarded. He was exactly right. As MIT professor Richard Lindzen observed, future generations will wonder in bemused amazement that the early 21st century developed world went into hysterical panic over a global average temperature increase of a few tenths of a degree that actually had already ended, and on the basis of gross exaggerations of highly uncertain computer projections combined into implausible chains of inference, proceeded to contemplate a rollback of the industrial age, which seems to be what's going on. Lindzen also said the future will view the response of contemporary science to global warming as another version of the Emperor's New Clothes. If you go to it and like what you see, I think we have a live version up. I update it every day. Put in 3 to 5 new stories every day. Today we had a story from the Wall Street Journal by Kimberly Strassel, very excellent piece.